Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, New Hope family? Welcome to the Grow Podcast, episode, what do we got? 74. Episode 74. My name is David. I'm very happy that you joined us today. With me, as always, is Pastor Mike.
What's with the hoodie today?
I'm cold today, and I don't know. Michael thinks I'm getting
sick.
You're
never cold.
Because I'm never cold. So Michael has decided I'm getting sick.
I do have the warm, kind of Christmassy sweater on.
Don't say kind of Christmassy.
Well, it is. This is coming out the week after Thanksgiving, so I'm allowed.
But that's what I'm saying. Don't pretend that it's not Christmassy by calling it kind of Christmassy.
It's a winter sweater. It's not a Christmassy sweater.
It's an Xmas sweater. It's just kind of Christmassy.
Is that what it is?
Yes, it's a very Christmassy sweater.
It's warm because I'm cold.
But yeah, I don't know. I've just been. I mean, it's like freezing cold and insanely windy outside. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that's why.
It is crazy today.
And some of our lovely coworkers, whom I love, blast heaters in their rooms, which then makes the system that heats all of our offices think that it's super hot.
Yeah.
So it never kicks on in our office, which again, I much prefer over the alternative. Yeah. I'm just a little cold today. I don't know what the deal is.
Looking kind of emo there with that on. Yeah.
I missed the emo phase. I was like a little too old for that. So I'm trying to dig back into it now. I'm trying to earn the respect of all the emo kids out there. Are there still emo kids? Is that still a thing? Michael, is that still a thing? Producer off camera? None of us know. We're all too old. Far too old. Emo music was great though. What's your favorite emo band, Pastor Mike?
I don't even know the name of an emo band. I was with Pastor Andrea and I, and Pastor Kylie and I were talking the other day, and Pastor Andrea, we know she went through kind of an emo phase years ago. We've seen pictures. It's awesome.
It's fantastic.
And she was naming emo bands. You'd think I'd remember, but not one of them did I recognize.
I was like a fan of like punk music in the late 90s, but especially early 2000s. And then that kind of like morphed into the emo genre, but I kind of got out of it right around that time. So I didn't follow punk music into the emo world. There was a band called Simple Plan when I was in high school and maybe my first year or two of college, that they were kind of like they were like punk music, but they were like the first emo punk band, and pop punk and so apparently that's what my hood has begat today. If you're ever wondering if we plan what we're going to talk about in the beginning of
not
this,
at the beginning,
clearly not, as we just talked about my hood and emo music for 5 minutes. We should have had, you know what we don't have, Michael, is I don't have a timer. So I'm going to need you to be my timer when we've got about 5 minutes left. Give me a sign, okay? But today we are talking about. I'll be honest. When I saw your notes for this podcast, this is probably as excited as I've been.
Really?
I was very disappointed when I missed. What was the one I missed? Hattie filled in.
Hattie. A few weeks ago.
Whatever the episode was, I missed with Hattie. I was really looking forward to doing that one, and I missed it. But this one, when I saw your notes, I was very excited about, because one of the things that you had in your notes is something that nerd David, as an adult, has purchased lots of books on and studied, and it's just like one of my favorite pieces of history that fascinates me. So I'm very excited when we get to that. We're probably going to linger there longer than you were planning.
Okay, this will be fun.
But so we're in Promised Land right now.
Yep.
That's the series we're in. Second to last one was this last Sunday. So we got to Young David is kind of what we titled that one.
The only character, and it sounds like a character in a story, not a real person, obviously a real person, to date that we spent more than 1 week on.
Well, it's because of his name. It's a pretty good name.
Spelled differently.
Well, his was spelled in Hebrew. So yes, definitely spelled differently. But so we had Young David as the focus of the weekend. It was a really good teaching. So the first thing we want to talk about that I think if you grow up in the church, it's something that you just never question because you just grew up with the story. So you're like, well, yeah, David fought Goliath. Goliath challenged everybody that, you know, or if you've studied history and you're familiar with these types of things that would happen at times. But why wouldn't the Israelites just be like, well, we're just going to fight you with an army? Like, we can't beat that one guy, so we're just going to use our army. Or same thing with the Philistines. They'd be like, we have this giant champion.
Let's send 50 guys out to take the one guy out.
Yeah. Why are we just doing the one warrior thing?
Well, what's so interesting with it too, and you may have run across this if you've done a lot of reading on it, is, you know, like growing up in church for me, you know, the Philistines were the enemy. So I always kind of pictured them as the barbaric, less cultured.
And at least when I was growing up, any like depictions of them were absolutely, you know, they look, you know, the Israelites are dressed in like nice robes and they're in like loincloths or, you know, animal furs or whatever. But that's almost certainly a very, very inaccurate depiction of the Philistines.
They were, and that's one of the reasons why their paganism and the worship of their gods was such a obstacle and a tripping point to the Israelites. They were highly cultured, highly civilized compared to everybody else, even clean shaven, which was kind of a sign for of high culture in that day. In fact, some of them, they were around kind of the Aegean Sea. Some of them were the predecessors to the Greeks, who's influenced like all of our Western culture,
so
right?
The Philistines are what I was referring to earlier. And up until very recent history, non-biblical historians would say the Philistines
they didn't exist.
There's no such thing. Like, this is something that's made up in the Bible. At best, it's misattributed to them, but no, they didn't exist. And then archaeology once again started to catch up with the Bible. It's amazing how that just keeps happening. And so it started to catch up. But one of the things that fascinates me about the Philistines is there's these people that there's a theory that kind of popped up in the late 1800s called the Sea Peoples theory. And these people from the sea is basically how they're always mentioned. And they had a huge part of like the fall of the Bronze Age Egypt, and right around the time of the fall of the Hittite Empire as well. And it was all happening right as the Philistines were starting to pop up, not in Mycenae, Greece, where they most likely came from, but as they migrated over. And the most widely accepted theory at this point is the Philistine theory now, that those sea peoples were the Philistines. And so not only were they not this like barbarian tribe but they were like this mighty empire I shouldn't say mighty empire, but these mighty warriors with advanced military tactics and advanced naval capabilities that
better weaponry
that almost no empire was being able to stand up to at the time, much less, there's some famous battles that the Egyptians did win, but they were responsible for a lot of destruction and losses. So as I learned that, I literally have 4 books in my bookshelf at home that I have read just about that. But I just think so often we're just like, they were just these, pesky Philistines that the Israelites had to deal with. Really, the Israelites were
we would think of them today as like they were the first world.
Absolutely.
And like the Israelites would have been like second, third, kind of world, or third nation. And so their culture was very appealing. It's like they're wealthy, so it must be, because if somebody's doing better, it must be because of their gods, right? Because that's how everything worked. And because of that, this is where the single warrior combat was seen as more cultured. And when you think about it, it's like, we're just going to each send out our best, and whichever one of them wins, we're just going to declare that the winner. And it wasn't necessarily like declaring, now the whole nation needs to be subject to it. They were often fighting over, and we don't know exactly what they were fighting over. Like, is this land? Is this well? Is this mountain? Who's it going to belong to? And so we don't exactly know here whether they were fighting over like 5 wells or whatever. It most likely wasn't over who was going to rule whoever at this point, because that probably would have been a bigger battle.
Sure, you're not gonna submit to one warrior versus one warrior if it's you can wipe out our entire nation. Well, at that point we might as well fight a full scale war.
And let's just waste, instead of wasting a bunch of people, let's just waste 2 people. And so it and what was so telling about this was the Israelite side. The obvious choice was Saul.
Sure.
Because when he was chosen, he was head and shoulders of everybody else. Everybody looked at him and said, oh, he's a bigger warrior, he's a better warrior. He had full armor, which would have been very unusual. Even when you fast forward to like medieval times where armor making and things was more prolific, only certain people,
only the wealthiest had
armor. And you have, this tall, big, built, well-built, equipped, arrogant, every right to be arrogant Goliath. And if you've ever read Malcolm Gladwell's stuff, he probably had some physical...
I've never heard anyone say every right to be arrogant.
Oh, yeah,
but I mean, it is. It's fun. It just makes me laugh.
But he probably had some physical challenges, but they were hidden. He obviously was strong when you look at, and I talked about it over the weekend, if you listened to the teaching before this, of just how heavy his armor was and everything. And over here you had the Israelites, who were children of God, who they're called to be chosen of God, and God's hand is on them, but they don't have the wealth and power that the Philistines do, and they don't have a Goliath. They're Saul, who's not anywhere close. And so you can imagine being an Israelite who you can't beat a Goliath. The guy standing next to you can't beat Goliath. And you stand there for 40 days, it says, and you listen to the jeers and the taunts and begin to wonder, where's our God? God, why? I mean, I've heard all these stories. Are they all just made up, the parting of the Red Sea and all these plagues? Because I wasn't there. Is Dagon their God? Is he bigger? Is he better? And then on the 41st day, this kid shows up carrying lunches. And he says, I got this. Now, we make it sound like he's the underdog, and he is the underdog. But the reality of it is a sling. If you've ever done studies into the slings, these slings that he used, were these spinning things, not like this kind of slingshot, these spinning things. And armies had slingshot people, and this was before really the invention, widely prolific invention of the bow. They were incredibly accurate, incredibly deadly. But to use against someone as well armored as him was a challenge, unless you were very confident in your accuracy, which David was. He was very confident in his accuracy. So you get this on this 41st day, this little kid carrying lunches carrying 5 stones, not one. And one of the things that teachers, scholars love to point out, the reason he carried, that many stones, because he knew how many brothers Goliath had, which we find out later. He had that many brothers. So he's like, I'm ready for the others. Go ahead, bring them on, kind of thing. But it answers that kind of historic question for us, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about it next week on the podcast as we overview like all of David's life. And I'll kind of give a preview on it. David thought outside the box. One of the reasons he was such a great warrior was on the battlefield. He didn't think just normal strategy. Sure. He thought outside the box. We'll touch on that a little bit more next week.
Yeah, it's another thing that I love about David is I've studied non-biblical historians like trying to break down his strategy and his tactics and almost his mob-like way of dealing with things at times. And he's a very fascinating historical figure on top of his importance to our faith and him being a man after God.
There's an author, and his books aren't available in like paper print, but you can get digital versions of them. His name is Cliff Graham. And he's a former Navy SEAL. So he's a military tactician. He's also a historian. Yeah. And he's done all the history, and then he's walked all of the places in Israel where all these things are. And he wrote historical fiction, like as just telling David's story. It's some of my favorite books to read.
Ooh, I might have to borrow those.
I was actually invited a few years ago, and it just didn't work out to actually go to Israel with him and some other people, and that would have just. Oh, wow. I'm so disappointed it didn't work out. But they're just fascinating books because I like historical fiction, and he just makes it so real. Yeah. He's actually working on a deal right now to make a movie out of it. I hope it turns out good. Awesome. Turns out well.
We said, I don't remember if we said at the beginning of the podcast, but we're gonna focus on talking about dealing with difficult people today.
I think I said it in the teaching over the weekend.
Yeah, that's why I'm here. You're gonna teach everyone how to deal
with David.
But Saul became because in this instance, Saul was extremely helpful to David. He was like, "Hey, here's my armor, or like whatever you need." And David was like, "This is."
But have you ever thought
tried
about
to
that?
be helpful? I
Have you
should
ever
say.
thought about that? You'd think Saul would be saying, "No way, I'm
Right.
not sending the kid," but he's like, "Oh, okay." So and we really don't know his motivation
Yeah.
there. It's like finally someone to step up
Right,
and he's
been
desperate,
waiting for 40 days.
or okay, because I've been around Samuel, I know who God is. I just don't have faith in him myself, but I'll trust someone else who has faith in him. We really don't know his motivation, but he was more than willing to sacrifice David.
Well, is there any chance he knew that David had been like anointed as the next king?
We don't know that.
Because that could be another, he's like, good luck being king after Goliath
Because we don't know
smashes
that,
you
because
into
we
the
find out later he was intent that Jonathan was going to
Right.
be king. Because he didn't know. I don't think so yet, because he went back later and asked who this kid was.
Oh, yeah.
So, and then later, invited him into the temple court to be part of that. So I don't think he fully knew.
Maybe it was
yet.
just 40 days of desperation.
Yeah, it was just the little town of Bethlehem that knew.
I would like to not be here for another 40 days so this kid can go die.
And maybe it was, it's just over a well. It's just over a tract of land. If we lose, we lose. So we'll sacrifice the kid.
Or like you said, maybe he was still, connected with God at that point, and God was like, let this kid fight.
All along, even later on, we find that he still believes in God, but it's almost like he believed in God as one of the gods. We don't know that for sure, but just I'll have faith in someone else's faith. Like he had faith in Samuel's faith until Samuel wasn't around.
Yeah. Well, he became more and more increasingly difficult for David over the course of pre-King David. I mean, just incredibly.
Tried to kill him personally in the room at least twice.
Yep.
Threatened to kill him multiple times, sent an army after him multiple times.
Interestingly, David at one point ends up living with these Philistines that he's fighting against. Like I said, to fight again or to be safe from the army. That is, it's craziness.
Sent his family to be protected by the Philistines that he was fighting against. Again, he was an outside-the-box thinker kind of person.
So why don't you
Lessons.
let's use David and Saul here, and why don't you teach us how to do it?
Here's the first tough one, I think, for all of us to remember. You will be criticized. It's easy to say, but it's hard for us to accept. We think about when he was chosen. His brothers criticized him. His dad didn't even include him. It's like, when Samuel asks the question, do you have any other kids? Stupid question. It's like, whatever. Mm-hmm. And Jesse kind of goes, oh, yeah, there's David. And like we talked about, the word that he uses is, well, he is David, but he didn't amount to anything. Mm-hmm. And then you have Saul, all these people criticizing him. So you have to, if you're going to get anywhere in life, whether you're a leader or not, you've got to learn how to deal with criticism. And I'll be honest, I'm still learning this one. Mm-hmm. I'm still trying to figure this out.
Tough one.
And I think there's two things that have helped me, and part of them are from David's life. First of all, know who the enemy is. One of my favorite things to do is sit down with couples who are getting ready to get married and try and teach them conversation. Mm. And I try to teach them skills how to fight, but I can't do that until they're actually having a fight.
So you induce fights during
sometimes
premarital
I give them
conversations?
exercises to potentially bring up conflict because they're going to have it, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So, but I teach them, and just recently in one of the times I had with this young couple, and they're pretty young. I was so excited because they just had a fight, and they're looking at me like, "Why are you so excited to have a fight?" But one of the reasons I was excited is because they went for like a couple hours, and then one of them. And here's what they said to me, and it was just brilliant. I mean, they realized this without me having to even teach them. I realized I was fighting, she said, I realized I was fighting him when the problem was the problem. Hmm. And we have to realize, with difficult people, sometimes it's the person, but know who the enemy is. Goliath was the enemy, not his brothers. The reason his brothers criticized him is because they were scared. And so often negative people, the problem isn't you. It's their own insecurity. It's their own thing. So pay attention to the source. His brothers have been listening to Goliath for 40 days. Yeah. Second thing is stay focused on the cause. Like in this case, Goliath was the enemy. But the cause was we have to respond so that the people will know who God is. The cause wasn't just we need to kill Goliath.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't respond, people are going to lose faith in God. So pay attention, and like we talked about Sunday, pay attention to your own preparation. Stay focused on the cause. I think another thing to remember in dealing with difficult people is boundaries are okay. We sometimes feel guilty when we draw boundaries.
Yeah.
Now, boundaries are different than isolation. Sometimes we isolate ourselves, like, I'll never be hurt by this again. We make a vow. I'll never allow anybody to hurt me that way again. And what do? Then we never allow anybody to get close enough to hurt us. And part of this is you don't have to put up with abuse. You don't have to put up with unsafe, dysfunctional things. But you can draw a boundary without totally cutting that person off.
Yeah.
Let them make the decision whether they're going to cut themselves off. And we could probably spend 5 podcasts on this, but there's a great teacher out there. If you're on YouTube, go look up Dr. Henry Cloud. And he wrote the book, Boundaries. It just talks about how to do this. With David, when Saul was hunting him down, he didn't stay there and go, okay, I need to stay close. Okay. He hid in the desert.
Yep.
He put boundaries.
Yep.
But he was more than willing to reconcile.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't say, I'll never speak to him again.
Sure.
He was more than willing to reconcile. Third thing, and this is huge, give honor without excusing sin. David refused to remove Saul. He could have, because he was anointed king. But he said, that's God's job, not my job. So he continued to honor him. And one of the great stories was David hiding out in a cave. And Saul goes in the cave. He's hunting for David. He goes in the cave, and we find out he goes in the cave to go to the bathroom. This is why he went in the cave. And David, I just get this picture, and I just going to go, ugh. David sneaks up behind him while he's going to the bathroom.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. It's like, first of all, vulnerable position, but really, do you want to get that close? And he cuts off a portion of Saul's robe, whether it was still on him or whether it was laying off the side, we don't know. But and then feels guilty about it and goes out and says, he asks Saul for forgiveness, even though Saul is the one hunting him down, and basically said, just because you treat me poorly doesn't mean that I have an excuse to treat you poorly. And I know for me, and I talk about this with pastors, it's real easy when people leave the church to be offended by that, and be angry about that. But you just, regardless of how they leave, what they do, one of the things I've learned is I'm going to still treat them with honor. And part of what that does is then if the Lord does something with them in their heart, they're more than welcome to come back.
Yeah.
And we can have those conversations. And I think part of that is don't give him the pressure for revenge. David's guys were like, he's in your hands, kill him. Revenge is not in your hands. Romans chapter 12 says that, kindness. 2 things I'll just kind of land on real quick. You need a community. If you're going to deal with difficult people, you need a community. David had his mighty men around him. Yep. He also had a Jonathan, someone who put David's interest before his own. Jonathan could have been with his dad to kill David because, he was giving up the throne. Jonathan, honestly, and he says this, I think you'll be a great king, and I'll be your number 2. I'll come right behind you. When by every other standard in the world, Jonathan should have been the next king. Yeah. And that had to have been huge for David to process the pain of difficult people.
So we need to befriend the son of the difficult person we're trying to deal.
But part of what do? We cut off people who are related to or close to that person because they're that person. Why? It's not their fault that there's a difficult person there. And I think this last one is the biggest one. Process your pain with difficult people with God. All you have to do is read the book of Psalms. And I don't know that a lot of what David struggled with Saul, and most of those Psalms were written while David was hiding in caves and hiding in fields and hiding in houses, running for his life, hiding with the enemy. I don't think most of that was found processing happened in his conversation with people. He spent time in worship and complaining and talking. God, this sucks. God, this is horrible. So I think the more you're dealing with difficult people, the more time you have to make sure you're giving to your time with God.
I think for some of us, even when we accept that yes, it's okay for me to complain to God or to share my frustration with him, that's not the easiest part of prayer, right? Or even just spending quiet time or whatever you want to call it. It's much harder for me to, it's easy to do one of two things. Just be like super mad at him and be like, you suck. And like, I'm mad at you for this, or to just ask for stuff.
Yeah.
But the listening part, which we've talked about recently, and then just the like you said, processing that with God, that can be like a difficult discipline to learn. Do you have any advice on that one?
I think part of it is, remember, processing. So think about it. We don't think about God in terms of every other relationship, right? So when you're processing with someone else, you aren't just puking your emotions.
Right.
I mean, you might for a while.
Right. Maybe how it starts.
And that's okay. And you read Psalms, and there's a lot of emotional puking happening there.
Can this podcast be named Emotional Puking, please?
We could. We might do that. But you notice David also, he obviously then stops and, all right, now I've had my say. Yeah. Now you have your say. And what do you want to say in this? And we find, phrases like trust in the Lord with all your heart. And you read on down, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Cast all your cares. All these kinds of things that are woven in Psalms, later in Proverbs, written by Solomon. That Solomon passes on with those kinds of things. But we find these things every single psalm, with fairly few exceptions, always come back to. But God, you're good, and they always come back to. And the language we're using in this is an upper story conclusion, right? God, I can't see it, but you're involved.
Yeah.
You're at work. And I'm just going to trust that you're involved and you're at work. Would you please show me where you're involved and you're at work? But I'm going to rest in that right now. Be still and know that he is God. And I think that processing, it's not just pouring out my heart, but also pausing and listening.
You have any homework for us this week, Pastor Mike? Next steps? Like that?
Our next step in this whole series is make sure you're reading that chapter in the story.
Yep.
That chapter in the story. But if you're dealing with difficult people, most of us are, take one of those things that we just talked about. What one do you need to work on the most? Probably the last one for most of us. Of just processing.
There were six things?
There's 6 of them.
We'll list those in the podcast notes or in the YouTube description, whatever that's all called. We'll get those listed for everybody so that they can see them. Sometimes it's nice to look at them. Well, thank you, Pastor Mike. As always, like I said, I could have probably spent about 4 hours talking about the Philistines because I nerd out about that stuff, but
it's cool stuff.
No one would have stayed for the more important part after that. So thank you for letting me talk about it a little bit. Thanks to all of you for being here. We so very much appreciate those of you that join us on the Grow podcast. Please leave a comment or send an email or something if you have any thoughts, positive or negative. I think we talked about that, right? I have to deal with criticism. Help me grow by sending in some criticism. We want to get better. But genuinely, that does help us. So if you have any thoughts like that, or just you just want to connect and let us know that you're enjoying the Grow podcast, we always appreciate hearing that as well. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't done that yet, so you get notified when new episodes go up. We will see you next week as we talk about King David. We'll be done talking about King Saul by then. We'll be on King David, our last week of Promised Land. So if you're listening to this the week that this goes up, make sure you join us at one of our New Hope campuses next week, and we will see you soon.